In 1 BCE, Zhao Feiyan, the woman later branded the most licentious in China's history, faced the end of her reign. Once a palace dancer who entranced the Han Emperor, she became the subject of relentless whispers, secret meetings, illicit favors, alliances sealed behind closed doors. Her beauty had lifted her to the dragon throne, but in the eyes of her enemies, it had also poisoned the empire she once adorned. They said she could walk across the petals of a flower without bruising them, that the soles of her feet barely bent the blades of grass beneath her weight, and that when she turned her head, the movement was so delicate it seemed the air itself was carrying her. Zhao Feiyan's legend began not in the golden chambers of the Han imperial palace, but in the shadowed corners of the Marquis of Yangdi's residence, where the clink of cups and the slow, hypnotic beat of drums accompanied the measured glide of dancers who had learned to turn their bodies into poetry. Born into obscurity, with a family name that carried no political weight and no ancient title to offer her protection, she had nothing but the fragile weapon of her beauty and the discipline of her training. She was taught early that a woman's survival in such halls depended not only on grace of movement, but also on the ability to make each movement speak, to suggest without saying, to promise without giving, to linger in the mind long after the performance had ended. In the Marquis's household, she was one among many young girls whose faces were painted and whose wrists were taught to bend like willow branches in the wind. Yet even among them, she was different. Her frame was so slight that she seemed to float rather than step, her skin pale as moonlight seen through thin silk, and her eyes carrying a watchful intelligence that betrayed her ability to read the room, to know who was looking, to understand the direction of power before it was spoken aloud. It was during one such evening, when the lamps burned low and the wine had softened the voices of the noble guests, that her path began to shift toward destiny. A visiting court official whose duty it was to scout for talents worthy of the imperial gaze noticed her, not for the extravagance of her movements, but for the way she seemed to draw silence around her, as if the entire hall were holding its breath for her to finish a single turn. This was the beginning of the chain, one introduction leading to another, one whispered recommendation opening the next door, until at last she was summoned to the palace itself, to stand in the outer court among dozens of other candidates, each painted, jeweled, and trained to perfection, each hoping for the same impossible fate: to be chosen by the emperor. The Han imperial court at that time was a place of both brilliance and decay, where silk banners fluttered above courtyards paved with white stone. And yet the air was heavy with suspicion, intrigue, and the quiet knowledge that beauty could elevate or destroy with equal speed. Emperor Cheng of Han, already known for his fondness for art, music, and delicate company, walked among the gathered women with the cool, measuring eye of a man who understood both the pleasures and the dangers of indulgence. When his gaze fell upon Zhao Feiyan, it was not the embroidered hem of her gown, nor the jeweled pins in her hair that held him. It was the stillness between her breaths, the precision of her bow, and the way her eyes lowered just enough to suggest humility, while still allowing the briefest flicker of daring to pass through. In that moment, though she could not have known it, the shape of the empire's private life shifted. Her first days in the palace were a blur of corridors that twisted like a maze, of attendants who measured every word before speaking, and of rituals designed to test her composure as much as her skill. She learned to walk at the exact pace that conveyed deference without haste, to keep her sleeves arranged so that her hands appeared smaller and more delicate, and to speak in a voice so soft that men would lean closer, thereby allowing her to read their faces at a distance only she controlled. Yet it was in the dance hall that she became unforgettable. The music would begin in slow, almost imperceptible waves, her sleeves trailing like pale smoke as she moved, the lamplight catching on the faint sheen of her skin. And each turn of her wrist seemed to loosen the knots in the emperor's thoughts, each step drawing him further from matters of state and deeper into the orbit of her presence. By the time the first winter frost had touched the palace gardens, Zhao Feiyan was no longer merely another favored performer. She had been moved to private quarters closer to the emperor's residence, her meals brought by servants who spoke only in whispers, her robes of finer silk than those of the other consorts. Rumors began to circulate, not in the open courts, but in the quieter corners of the palace kitchens and the guarded corridors of the eunuchs' quarters, that she had captured not only the emperor's attention, but also his rarest commodity, his trust. For a woman who had once measured her life in the rhythm of dance steps, this was the beginning of a new performance, one without an audience she could see. And yet she knew every gesture mattered. In the private rooms, scented with sandalwood and dim with golden lamplight, she learned that her words could shape the emperor's moods, that her laughter could ease the sting of political disappointment, and that her silences could weigh more heavily than speeches delivered in the imperial court. Outside those rooms, however, the air was changing. Ministers watched the emperor's increasing absence from morning councils. The empress of the time felt the cold edge of displacement drawing nearer. And the older concubines, who had once enjoyed seasons of favor, began to see in Zhao Feiyan not a fellow ornament of the court, but a threat. A reminder that in the Han palace, beauty was both a ladder and a blade, and it was never clear which end one was holding. In those days, Zhao Feiyan's name began to drift beyond the palace walls, carried in songs that likened her to the swallow, a creature light enough to fly through storms without wetting its feathers. In the city markets, young women would try to imitate her hairstyles, the curve of her brows, the delicate tilt of her head, and merchants sold silks in shades they claimed were favored by the new imperial beauty. But such adoration came with a shadow. For every admirer who sang of her grace, there was another voice that whispered of her ambition, of the danger of allowing someone from such a humble origin to rise so high in a world where rank and birth were meant to determine destiny. She, however, understood better than anyone that the higher she climbed, the thinner the air became, and that every step toward the emperor's heart was also a step onto a narrowing path from which there would be no turning back. Yet for now, the music still played, the lamp still burned for her, and the emperor still called her by name. And in the fragile quiet between each of her breaths, Zhao Feiyan already knew. The palace was a stage, the empire an audience, and her body, light as a swallow, was the only instrument she would ever need to keep them both enthralled. In the months that followed her first winter in the palace, Zhao Feiyan learned that survival in the Han court was never simply a matter of beauty or skill, but of timing, of knowing when to speak and when to let silence carry the message, of recognizing which passing remark was harmless and which was a signal to shift alliances. And it was in this hidden arena of glances and pauses that she began to rise, each step carefully measured, yet appearing effortless, like the unbroken arc of a swallow's flight through the evening sky. The emperor's affection for her was no longer a subject for whispers in the back corridors. It had become a visible reality, reflected in the gifts that arrived at her quarters. Lacquered boxes filled with hair ornaments of jade and gold, bolts of silk in rare colors brought from far provinces. Even a small music ensemble assigned to her rooms so that she could summon song at any hour. The other women of the harem saw these signs and understood what they meant, that the emperor's visits to their chambers were fewer, his interest fading like lantern light at dawn. And in the silent competition that was the imperial harem, Such shifts were the difference between influence and exile. Feiyan's ascent was marked by her ability to transform the emperor's desire into a form of political gravity. When she was present at a banquet, the emperor laughed more easily, spoke more warmly, lingered longer at the table, and when he was alone with her in the quiet of his private hall, she could speak of court matters not as demands, but as curiosities, shaping his perceptions with the same subtle grace she used to shape a dance. Never forcing, only guiding, until he believed the thought had been his from the start. It was inevitable that such influence would place her in direct tension with the sitting empress, a woman whose position had once been as secure as the carved stone of the palace walls. Yet the very nature of imperial favor was that it could not be commanded, only courted. And with each passing season, the emperor's attention drifted further from the woman who held the title to the woman who held his mind, until at last the imbalance could no longer be hidden. The process of replacing an empress was not a sudden act, but a slow erosion, a wearing away of ceremony and obligation until the position itself seemed hollow. Feiyan's opponents watched in frustration as her proximity to the emperor became a constant, as her counsel began to influence not only his personal moods, but his scheduling, his entertainments, even his absences from court. And though they plotted, they could not act without cause, for she was careful never to overreach in public, allowing her power to remain unspoken yet undeniable. When the moment finally came, when the old empress was quietly moved to distant quarters under the polite pretense of illness, it was met with little resistance, for by then the shift had been so complete that it felt almost natural. The court scribes recorded the transition as a formal elevation, and Zhao Feiyan, once a dancer in the household of a marquis, was named the legitimate wife of the Son of Heaven. Her title sealed with the imperial seal, her status proclaimed in the grand hall before ministers and envoys who had no choice but to bow. On the day of her installation, the palace was transformed into a tapestry of red and gold, with musicians stationed in every courtyard, their melodies weaving through the air like threads of silk and the scent of rare incense carried on the winter wind. Feiyan walked the length of the ceremonial hall with the precision of one who knew that every step would be remembered, her robes trailing behind her in ripples that caught the light, her expression composed yet distant, for she understood that the crown she now wore was not a gift, but a bargain, one that would demand more than it gave. From her new position as empress, the boundaries of her influence extended beyond the walls of the women's quarters. She could now summon ministers for private audiences under the guise of conveying the emperor's questions. She could intercede in matters of appointments and favors. She could reward loyalty not only with trinkets, but with real advancement. And as her name appeared more frequently in the petitions and records of the court, it became clear that she was no longer simply the emperor's ornament. She was becoming an axis of power in her own right. Yet power in the Han court was never solitary. It thrived in networks, in the careful weaving of loyalties and debts. And Feiyan, understanding this, began to draw her younger sister, Zhao Hede, into the inner circle, presenting her not only as a companion to herself, but as another source of delight for the emperor. Together they created an atmosphere of indulgence that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous, for while it deepened the emperor's attachment, it also sharpened the envy and resentment of those who saw their influence expanding unchecked. The presence of the two sisters at the center of imperial life was like a rare bloom in the palace gardens. Admired by some for its beauty, feared by others for its potential to spread and dominate the ground. Visiting envoys from distant states reported back to their rulers not only on the policies of the Han dynasty, but on the extraordinary favor shown to these women, their descriptions tinged with both fascination and caution. For history had taught that when the balance of power shifted toward the private chambers, the public face of governance could suffer. Still, for the moment, Feiyan's reign as empress seemed untouchable. The emperor's health was strong, his affections unwavering, and her command of the subtleties of court life unmatched. She understood the choreography of audiences and banquets, the layering of meaning in a gift or a gesture, the art of letting an enemy believe they had scored a small victory while quietly securing a larger one for herself. And in these early years, she moved with the assurance of someone who had mastered not only the dance of the stage, but the infinitely more perilous dance of power. Yet in the stillness of her private moments, when the music faded and the courtyards lay quiet beneath the moon, she must have known, as all who rise to such heights must, that favor was a current, not a stone, and that the same tide that had carried her from the shadows to the dragon throne could just as easily turn, leaving her stranded. But for now, the tide was hers, and the empire itself seemed to bend, however slightly, to the rhythm of her steps. By the time Zhao Feiyan had settled fully into her role as empress, the Han Palace had transformed into something that seemed less like the austere seat of an empire, and more like an endless theater where night itself became the curtain, where the moment the sun's last light left the glazed tiles of the roof, the lamps were lit. The courtyards glowed with golden halos of oil flames, and the air filled with the mingled scents of incense, warm wine, and the faint, powdery sweetness of cosmetics that clung to every corridor. In these hours, those long, indulgent stretches between dusk and dawn, the emperor withdrew from the heavy matters of state, and instead the palace became his playground, a stage on which Zhao Feiyan performed not the formal dances of her earlier years, but the subtler, more dangerous choreography of intimacy and command, where each word was chosen to flatter, each laugh timed to coincide with the emperor's shifting moods, each glance toward a favored guest calculated to suggest welcome without surrender. The evenings were structured like elaborate performances, yet they disguised themselves as spontaneity. Musicians would begin with soft, lilting melodies that echoed off the lacquered beams, serving as a backdrop for low conversation and the first cups of wine. But as the night deepened, the music would swell, the rhythms quickening, and the guests, selected by Feiyan herself, would draw closer, their voices warming under the influence of drink, their guarded faces opening just enough to reveal the ambitions or desires they usually hid in daylight. Whispers from later historians and court gossips would claim that these gatherings were nothing short of decadence, that the emperor's private halls became arenas of indulgence where pleasure was pursued as feverishly as power, where attendants, eunuchs, and even musicians were drawn into the orbit of the empress's charm. Yet the truth, as it often does, lay tangled between exaggeration and reality. For while the nights were indeed rich with luxury, they were also carefully curated tools of influence. Each guest invited not merely for companionship, but because their presence served a purpose in the intricate web Feiyan wove around the emperor. Her younger sister, Zhao Heda, was her most important accomplice in these affairs. For together, they created a dynamic that fascinated the emperor and disarmed those who might otherwise have seen Feiyan as a solitary rival. Heda, beautiful in a softer, more overtly playful way, would entertain with song or light banter, while Feiyan maintained a cooler elegance, her role more akin to the conductor of an orchestra, guiding the tempo of the night, ensuring that attention, conversation, and favors circulated according to her design. At such gatherings, political boundaries blurred. Ministers who might have opposed a policy during morning council would find themselves drawn into long, meandering conversations over cups of wine, their resistance softened not only by drink, but by the sensation of being in a rarefied, privileged circle. Military officers returning from the frontier would speak more freely, their words offering Feiyan a glimpse into the empire's outer edges, knowledge she could later use to position herself or her allies advantageously. The emperor, for his part, seemed to grow increasingly dependent on these knights. His absences from official court business lengthened, his mornings delayed, and the affairs of state, petitions, disputes, provincial reports, waited longer and longer for his attention. In the meantime, Feiyan ensured that those who wished for the emperor's ear found that the most direct route was through her, that an evening's place at her table could yield results far more swiftly than 100 formal memorials submitted through the proper channels. It was in these private halls, lit by hundreds of trembling flames, that the seeds of her eventual infamy began to take root. Court chroniclers, especially those writing in the reigns of later emperors, would describe these nights with moral outrage, casting Feiyan as the architect of a palace in moral collapse, accusing her of introducing not only personal indulgence, but also a dangerous erosion of the imperial order, as though the very act of pleasure-seeking at the center of power had become a political crime. Whether those accusations were wholly fair or merely the sharpened tools of later political propaganda hardly mattered. For once such stories took hold, they shaped the way her name would be remembered. She was no longer simply the empress who had risen from obscurity. She was becoming the emblem of a court that, in the eyes of its critics, had turned inward, feasting on its own luxuries while the provinces strained under mismanagement and unrest. And yet, in the moment itself, none of that seemed to trouble her. The music played on, the courtyards glowed, and the emperor's gaze remained fixed upon her, drawn again and again to the lightness of her movement, the poise of her posture, the way she seemed to turn even the smallest gesture into an act of meaning, refilling his cup, adjusting the folds of her sleeve, or offering a rare, lingering smile that suggested a shared secret no one else could guess. These nights were not without risk. The same ministers and attendants who allowed themselves to be lulled into ease by her hospitality could just as easily turn witness against her should the emperor's favor waver. And Feiyan, who had climbed to her position on the strength of both beauty and instinct, was not blind to the fragility of her standing. She knew that in a world where women's power was borrowed from men's affections, the line between influence and vulnerability was as thin as a strand of silk. Still, she played her role with the confidence of one who understood that in politics, as in performance, the illusion of control was often as important as control itself. She let the emperor believe he was the one choosing the guests, the one guiding the conversation, even as every turn of the evening unfolded according to her plan. And it was this subtlety, this refusal to wield power crudely, that allowed her to extend her reign over his private world far longer than many had predicted. But in the private corners of the palace, away from the light and the music, others were watching and waiting. The displaced empress, the neglected concubines, the ministers who feared the empire was drifting. All kept their silence for now, yet each stored away their grievances like weapons to be unsheathed at the right moment. For in the Han court, nothing was ever truly forgotten, and indulgence could be forgiven only as long as it served the stability of the throne. For the moment, though, the tide was still in her favor. The emperor's laughter still echoed down the colonnades long after the lamps had been extinguished, and the name Zhao Feiyan was still spoken in the same breath as beauty, elegance, and irresistible charm. But beneath the music and the scent of incense, another rhythm was building, a quieter, more dangerous one, the slow and steady beat of discontent gathering force, waiting for the night when the music would stop. If the Knights of Silk and Music had drawn Zhao Feiyan to the center of the emperor's heart, it was the whispers that followed in daylight which began to stain her name with something darker. For in a palace where every smile could hide a knife and every gesture might conceal a warning. The birth of a royal heir was not simply a matter of joy. It was the single most dangerous shift in power a woman could face. And for an empress whose influence depended entirely on the emperor's undivided favor, another woman's child could be the beginning of her end. The Han dynasty's survival depended upon sons, and in the women's quarters, the carrying of a child was both the highest honor and the greatest threat. For the mother of a future emperor, no matter how low her original rank, could ascend in status overnight. And the arrival of such an heir could anchor her position more securely than any title, more deeply than any favor, more permanently than beauty alone could hope to achieve. And it was in this dangerous arithmetic of the harem that the first accusations against Feiyan began to take form. Whispers said that the empress had a way of ensuring no rival ever succeeded in producing such a child. That if a concubine found herself carrying the emperor's seed, she would not carry it long for some unnamed powder or tincture, bitter in taste but quick in effect, would be sent quietly in her food or tea, leaving no trace by morning except the stillness of a womb now empty. No court record confirms this, and yet the persistence of the rumor was itself a kind of evidence. For in the palace, stories that survived were rarely born of nothing. The eunuchs, whose duty it was to move between chambers unnoticed, began to speak. Never in front of witnesses, never to anyone whose loyalty they did not trust. Of mysterious parcels delivered to the quarters of favored concubines. Of sudden illnesses that robbed these women of strength and left them pale and trembling for weeks. Of physicians summoned in haste only to leave with tight expressions and lowered eyes. And while none of these accounts were written in the official histories during Feiyan's lifetime, they would later be recorded by historians eager to paint her as the embodiment of the harlot who brings down the realm. It is difficult to know where truth ended and the sharpened pen of political revision began, for the art of condemning a fallen woman often involved weaving real actions with imagined sins. But what is certain is that the births the emperor should have celebrated became fewer and fewer, and the empress remained without a son of her own. In the language of the palace, this was an absence louder than any accusation, for it left her vulnerable to suspicion on both sides. Those who envied her believing she destroyed heirs to preserve her power. Those who wished her well fearing she could not bear one herself. As the years passed, the balance of affection in the emperor's heart might have been enough to protect her from open attack. Yet in the deeper machinery of the court, resentment was fermenting. Older ministers, already uneasy with the emperor's neglect of governance, began to align the stability of the dynasty with the need for a legitimate heir. And the fact that none had been born to the emperor's household became a political problem too dangerous to ignore. A problem that had only one visible obstacle: Zhao Feiyan. The empress, however, showed no sign of retreat. She continued to host gatherings, to select those who would have the emperor's ear, to involve her sister Hedda in the rhythms of court life, and to maintain her position at the emperor's side with the same careful blend of deference and dominance that had brought her to power in the first place. Yet she must have known that in the eyes of those who opposed her, every miscarriage, every sudden illness among the concubines, was another stone laid in the case against her. The women of the court, who understood better than anyone the stakes of such accusations, learned to smile at the empress while guarding themselves against her unseen hand. Some refused the food sent from her kitchens. Others pretended illness to avoid attending her private banquets. Still others sought the protection of powerful families outside the palace, for they understood that survival in the harem was not merely a matter of beauty or favor, but of enduring the storms that swept through without warning. In the city beyond the palace gates, the image of Zhao Feiyan began to shift. No longer was she solely the swallow-light beauty who had danced her way into the emperor's arms. She was now whispered of as the Empress with the empty cradle. A figure as feared as she was admired. A woman whose smile could light an entire hall and whose shadow, some claimed, could close a womb forever. Such stories traveled faster than truth, embroidered by each telling until they reached even the market stalls where peasants debated the nature of their ruler's decline. Historians writing generations later would seize upon these tales to cast Feiyan as the archetype of the Hongyan Huoshui, the beautiful woman who brings calamity, folding her into a lineage of femme fatales blamed for the downfall of dynasties. Whether this was an accurate portrait or the convenient scapegoating of a woman who had risen too far is impossible to say with certainty. But what is clear is that the stories of poisoned wombs became as much a part of her legacy as the dances that had first won her the throne. Inside the palace, the tension grew heavier, like the charged air before a summer storm. Every cough, every faintness among the women was quietly noted. Every change in the emperor's schedule scrutinized for signs that another concubine might be with child. And in those moments of hope or fear, the empress's name was never far from anyone's lips. Whether she truly acted to prevent the birth of rivals or whether the sheer weight of rumor did the work for her, the effect was the same. No child came to challenge her place. But power sustained by absence is a fragile thing. It does not inspire loyalty, only caution. And while caution might keep enemies from acting openly, it also keeps friends from standing beside you when the tide turns. Feiyan, for all her poise and mastery of the court's subtleties, was walking a path where each step left her more isolated, where the circle of those she could trust grew smaller with each passing year, until even the music of her evening gatherings could not entirely mask the silence in the spaces where allies once stood. And in that silence, somewhere beyond the candlelight, her enemies were waiting, their patience as sharp as any blade, knowing that in the palace, nothing was eternal. Not beauty, not favor, not even the throne itself. And that sooner or later, the accusations that had been whispered for so long would find the moment to be spoken aloud. By the time the first frost of another year clung to the palace eaves, it had become painfully clear to those who still kept track of imperial duties that the center of the Han dynasty no longer revolved around the great bronze drums of the morning court, or the long scrolls of policy awaiting the emperor's seal, but around the warm, perfumed glow of Zhao Feiyan's private chambers, where the air was always laced with incense and the sound of music never seemed to cease, where the emperor was so often found reclining beside the empress and her sister that ministers began to wonder if the throne itself had been quietly moved into those rooms. What had once been occasional absences from council became a pattern, and what had once been a pattern became the norm. The business of the empire, the dispatches from the borders, the grain reports from the provinces, the petitions from officials in far-off commanderies, waited longer and longer for the emperor's attention, their urgency fading into a backlog that no one dared to press too hard for fear of offending the one person who could still coax a decision from him. The empress, whose influence had become both the palace's most dazzling ornament and its most whispered liability. It was said that in those days, the court calendar itself began to shift, as if pulled out of shape by the gravity of Feiyan's entertainments. Banquets were scheduled on the same days, important councils were meant to be held. Audiences with foreign envoys were postponed so that the emperor might preside over private poetry contests. And when ministers attempted to raise matters of defense or law, they found themselves met with a polite nod, a vague promise to review the issue, and then the quiet closing of the topic, as if the mere act of bringing it up were an intrusion into a world that no longer recognized the hard edges of governance. Beyond the inner palace, the effects of this withdrawal began to show. Reports from the northern frontiers told of Xiongnu raiders testing the strength of border garrisons, while in the south, river floods damaged harvests and displaced thousands. Yet the relief measures that should have been swift were slow in coming, delayed by the labyrinthine path of communication that now wound through attendants, eunuchs, and, at its most effective, the Empress's favor. Those who understood this new order adapted quickly, seeking invitations to her gatherings as if they were audiences with the Emperor himself, knowing that a nod from Feiyan over a shared cup of wine might accomplish in a night what official channels could not manage in a month. Within the palace walls, the transformation was even more visible. The guards at the great gates began to note that visitors carrying gifts for the Empress were allowed entry more readily than those with petitions for the Emperor. The kitchens prepared more delicacies for her evening tables than for the ceremonial banquets of state. And the artisans who once worked exclusively on imperial commissions now found themselves creating new ornaments, costumes, and furnishings for the sisters Zhao, whose apartments had become a world unto themselves, part court, part stage, and entirely beyond the reach of those who disapproved. This reordering of priorities did not go unnoticed by the old guard of the court, men who had served under previous emperors and who measured the health of a dynasty not by the elegance of its festivals, but by the discipline of its laws. They began to speak to one another in guarded tones, meeting in shaded gardens or behind the thick doors of private libraries. Their words careful, but edged with a shared recognition that the empire's pulse was weakening, that its heartbeat was no longer set by the drum of governance, but by the rhythm of silk sleeves swaying under candlelight. Yet they also knew that to confront the emperor directly was to risk not only his displeasure, but also the Empress's retaliation, for she was no passive ornament to be brushed aside. Her network within the palace was woven tightly, from the highest-ranking eunuchs to the most discreet servants, and any word spoken against her had a way of reaching her ears before it reached the ears of those it was meant to persuade. More than one official who dared to question her influence found himself reassigned to distant provinces or quietly excluded from important gatherings. His absence explained away with the kind of politeness that left no opening for complaint. For Feiyan herself, these were perhaps the most intoxicating years of her life, when the boundaries between personal power and imperial authority had all but dissolved, when the emperor's reliance on her was so complete that she could, with a word or a glance, redirect the course of a conversation, alter the tone of a decree, or determine which projects received funding and which languished in neglect. And yet, if she noticed the widening cracks in the empire's outer walls, she gave no sign, perhaps believing that the strength of her hold on the emperor would outlast any storm, perhaps simply unwilling to admit that storms could reach the innermost chambers of the palace. The people beyond the Vermilion Gates, however, did not see her as the delicate swallow who had risen on grace alone. In their eyes, sharpened by hardship and rumor, she was becoming the embodiment of all that had gone wrong. A ruler in all but name who consumed the emperor's attention while the empire's needs went unanswered. A woman whose beauty had unseated the rhythms of governance and replaced them with a pageant that could not feed the hungry or secure the borders. Songs that had once praised her elegance began to twist into bitter ballads sung in the markets, where her name was paired with words like decay and neglect. And while such verses would never be sung within earshot of the palace guards, they spread nonetheless, carried on the breath of merchants, soldiers, and servants, until they formed a kind of shadow history alongside the official records, a history in which the palace itself had forgotten the emperor, and the emperor had forgotten the empire. Inside, even those who still sought her favor began to notice subtle shifts, a touch more wariness in the greetings of certain ministers, a hesitation in the eyes of attendants who once moved with unthinking loyalty, a faint echo of something like pity. from those who understood that such dominance over the emperor's heart could not be eternal. But Feiyan, ever poised, received these changes with the same composure she had worn since her first steps in the palace, as if by refusing to acknowledge the undercurrent, she could keep it from swelling into a tide. And so, the days passed into months, the months into years, each one drawing her further from the moment of her first dance and deeper into a reign of influence that had no legal name, but all the substance of power. Until the question was no longer whether the emperor could govern without her, but whether the empire itself could remember how to function without the glow of her presence, an illusion as fragile as the silks that draped her shoulders, and one that, as her enemies well knew, could unravel in a single night. It happened not with the crashing of doors or the clamor of soldiers in the courtyard, but with the quiet, almost tender stillness that precedes a storm. The kind of night when the lamps burn lower than usual and the air in the corridors feels heavy, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. In the depth of that stillness, Emperor Cheng of Han, once the center of Zhao Feiyan's orbit, once the man whose gaze had lifted her from obscurity to the dragon throne, breathed his last, and in the instant his heart stopped. The delicate structure of her world collapsed as silently and completely as a pavilion struck down in a single gust of wind. She had no warning, for the emperor's health had always been the subject of guarded conversations, managed by attendants and physicians who understood that in a court as volatile as theirs, news of weakness could become the spark for dangerous speculation. Even if there had been signs, a longer pause before rising from the couch, a faint weariness in his voice at the close of an evening, Feiyan might have dismissed them as the passing shadows of indulgent living, certain that the rhythm of their nights would carry on as it always had, each dawn arriving to find them still bound in the silks and whispers that had become the texture of their lives. But the night he died, there was no rhythm. Only the sudden arrival of messengers whose faces were pale even in the dim light. The soft but urgent shuffle of eunuchs gathering outside her chambers. The muted clang of bronze gongs being struck in slow, solemn sequence to summon the court to the reality they could no longer postpone. And for Feiyan, the realization must have come not as a sharp blade, but as a creeping cold, the kind that starts in the skin and seeps inward, until it reaches the heart and tells you, without the need for words, that everything you have known is over. In the strict hierarchy of the Han court, the death of an emperor was not simply a personal loss. It was the erasure of the very authority that had sustained those closest to him. And for an empress whose power rested almost entirely on his living favor, the change was instant and merciless. In the span of a breath, she went from being the most influential woman in the empire to a figure whose presence in the palace was suddenly without anchor, without the shield that had deflected every whisper, without the hand that had drawn her out of the shadows years before. The corridors that had once opened to her without question now seemed to close subtly. Attendants averting their eyes, eunuchs bowing a fraction lower but speaking less. Ministers who had once sought her approval disappearing into the routines of state as though they had never been near her. And while the ceremonial mourning began, black silks draped over pillars, slow processions moving through the courtyards, the sound of wailing echoing from the women's quarters. Feiyan found herself isolated in a way she had never known. Her sister, Zhao Heda, her only constant companion as the machinery of succession moved forward without them. There was no time for her to imagine a role in the new order, for the regents and senior ministers, already wary of her influence during the late emperor's life, acted quickly to strip her of position. She was removed from the title of Empress under the guise of honoring the mourning protocols, her seal and emblems taken into custody. And though no one dared to lay formal charges against her in those first days, the implication was clear. She was to have no voice in the transition, no access to the new emperor, no opportunity to secure her place in a court that would now be dominated by others. Her quarters, once a nexus of music and conversation, grew quiet except for the measured steps of the guards posted outside. Men who answered her requests with formality so cold, it might as well have been contempt. The food brought to her was plain, stripped of the delicacies she had once taken for granted. The silks she wore replaced with mourning robes that felt like chains. And each morning she woke to the knowledge that the laughter and warmth of her former life had been swept away with the turning of a single page in the Imperial Chronicle. Perhaps the most bitter part of this new reality was not the loss of luxury, though that was sharp enough, but the swiftness with which those who had once bowed to her found ways to look through her, as though she were a ghost wandering the palace. The musicians who had played at her gatherings, the poets who had praised her beauty in verse, the ministers who had smiled at her over cups of wine. All now kept their distance, their politeness a fragile mask over the relief that they no longer needed to navigate her influence. Even her enemies, those who had once watched her with narrowed eyes and measured her every movement, no longer bothered to conceal their satisfaction. In the way they moved through the palace, in the slightly quicker pace of their steps, in the way their voices carried when they spoke to others, she could sense the ease of men who believed a threat had been removed. And though they did not yet move against her openly, she could feel the inevitability of it, like the gathering of clouds before a downpour, each day bringing the storm a little closer. In the long hours of morning, when the palace lay wrapped in ceremonial quiet, Feiyan must have thought of the years that had led her here, the first invitation to dance before the emperor, the thrill of being chosen, the nights that seemed endless, the delicate balance she had maintained between pleasure and politics. And she must have seen, with the clarity that comes when there is nothing left to defend, how fragile it had all been, how dependent on a single life, and how quickly the empire could rewrite the story of a woman, once its central ornament, into the cautionary tale of an ambitious beauty brought low. The death of Emperor Cheng was more than the loss of a husband or a patron. It was the collapse of the stage on which she had built her entire identity, leaving her standing in the dark with no audience, no music, and no script to follow. The applause gone, the curtain fallen, and the door to the only world she had ever mastered closing behind her with a finality she could neither resist nor delay. And so, in the space of a single night, Zhao Feiyan became a relic of a reign already being dismantled. Her future no longer her own to shape, her days stretching ahead in the cold, unfamiliar shadow of a palace that had decided it no longer needed to remember her. The palace that had once opened for her like a blooming flower, now closed in on itself. Its doors and corridors no longer gateways to influence, but narrow passages leading only to confinement. And Zhao Feiyan, who had once walked through gilded halls with the ease of a woman who belonged to every space she entered, now found herself confined to a small and sparsely attended residence tucked deep within the warren of the women's quarters. A place where the air was still perfumed with faint traces of sandalwood and past luxury, yet carried the unmistakable scent of abandonment. Her new apartments, though technically within the imperial compound, were far from the center of court life, and every detail of their design seemed chosen to remind her of both the privilege she still technically possessed and the power that had been stripped from her. The walls were adorned with silk panels once gifted to her in better days, but they hung faded now, their embroidered swallows dulled by dust, the lacquered furniture polished by hands that no longer belonged to her loyal attendants, and the courtyards outside, once animated by the laughter of musicians and the shimmer of lanterns, stood empty, visited only by the occasional shadow of a passing guard. Her sister Zhao Feiyan, ever the quieter presence beside her, remained by her side for a time, yet even she could feel the weight of the silence that now surrounded them. Their conversations grew hushed, not out of intimacy, but because the walls seemed to listen. And though no one said as much, they both understood that every word spoken within those chambers might reach the ears of those who had long awaited their fall. The guards posted at her gates were polite but unyielding, their eyes sliding past her when she stepped into the courtyard, their hands tightening around their spears whenever she drifted too near the edge of her allotted space. And while they addressed her with the formal title befitting her former station, the words had the brittle sound of a formality drained of all warmth, a courtesy maintained only because the rules of the court demanded it. Days lost their structure without the rhythm of banquets, audiences, or evening performances. She woke to pale light seeping through lattice windows, took her meals in silence, and walked the same small loop of her courtyard until the paving stones seemed to memorize the sound of her steps. Her attendants, reduced in number and stripped of their former finery, moved like shadows themselves, performing each task with an efficiency that avoided both excess familiarity and the risk of appearing careless before unseen watchers. Outside her narrow world, the court continued to turn, but she was no longer part of its orbit. She heard fragments of its life in the distant echo of drums announcing the arrival of dignitaries, in the faint sound of processions passing beyond the walls, in the rare pieces of gossip whispered by the younger servants who had not yet learned to school their tongues. And each of these reminders cut as deeply as they connected her to the world she had once ruled by presence alone. Rumors about her life in isolation began to circulate beyond the palace, carried by those same servants when they visited the markets or returned to their families. Some claimed she had gone mad with boredom, pacing her rooms and speaking to herself. Others said she still dressed in her finest silks each evening, as though expecting the emperor to appear. While still others whispered darker tales, that she plotted revenge, that she summoned spirits, that she hoarded poisons the way other women hoarded jewels. The truth was far simpler and more painful. She waited, not for rescue, but for the next turn in a fate she no longer controlled. The few allies she had left on the outside had learned caution, for even an association with her name could attract the suspicion of those in power. Letters went unwritten, visits unmade, and her family, if they thought of her at all, remained silent, either too afraid or too resigned to risk drawing the attention of her enemies. In this way, her captivity was not marked by the clanging of chains or the slam of barred doors, but by the slow, almost invisible unraveling of every connection she had to the living world beyond her walls. There were moments, in the soft haze of late afternoon, when she would stand in the center of her empty courtyard and remember what it had felt like to move through the palace with music at her back, the scent of incense curling in her hair, the knowledge that her voice could change the course of an empire. Now, the only music was the call of distant birds. The only scent the faint mineral tang of rain on stone. And the only power she possessed was over the pace of her own footsteps. Yet her captivity was not without its peculiar cruelties. On festival days, when the palace came alive with color and sound, she could sometimes glimpse from her high, narrow windows the processions winding toward the main halls, the fluttering of banners, the gleam of new gowns in colors she no longer wore. She would watch until the last dancer disappeared from view. And in those moments, the weight of her exclusion was almost unbearable, for it was not the loss of power she felt most keenly, but the loss of being seen, of being part of the living pageantry that had once been her entire identity. The silence of her rooms became a mirror in which she was forced to confront herself. Not the legend of the swallow-light beauty or the feared manipulator of the harem, but the woman who had gambled everything on the affection of one man and built her world on a foundation that vanished with his final breath. In that reflection, she could no longer deny that every glance, every whispered promise, every careful step had been a performance played for an audience that was now gone, leaving her with nothing but the memory of the stage. If her enemies hoped that isolation would break her, they would have been disappointed by the way she carried herself in those days. She still walked with the same measured grace, still spoke in the same calm tones, still kept her hair arranged with precision even when there was no one to admire it, as if refusing to let the palace see her undone was the only rebellion left to her. Yet the truth, which she shared with no one, was that the walls were closing in, and the steady erosion of her world was not in the form of dramatic blows, but in the small, daily reminders that she no longer mattered. In the great halls where she had once been the axis of attention, decisions were now made without her knowledge, alliances formed without her name, and festivals celebrated without her presence. And in the stillness of her nights, lying on a bed stripped of the embroidered covers she once favored, Zhao Feiyan must have known that this was not a pause in her story, but its long, slow unspooling, a captivity gilded with the remnants of her past, yet hollowed by the absence of everything that had once made her life feel like it belonged to the living. It came, as endings often do in the palace, without announcement, without the grand spectacle that might have suited the fall of a woman once spoken of as the most beautiful in the empire, arriving instead in the form of a cup placed gently before her, by hands that trembled just enough to betray the weight of their task. And Zhao Feiyan, sitting in the dim light of her narrow chamber, knew before she touched it that whatever it contained would be the last thing she would ever drink. The year was 1 BCE, and by then she had lived long enough in confinement to understand the unspoken rules of her survival. That as long as she remained quiet, as long as she did not attempt to reach beyond the boundaries assigned to her, as long as her presence remained a shadow rather than a threat, she might be allowed to drift into obscurity. But the court, with its endless appetite for the erasure of inconvenient figures, had a different rhythm in mind. And she, who had once danced to the music of her own making, was now forced to move to theirs. Whether the order came from the highest levels of the new regime or from those who had waited years to avenge slights real or imagined, is a truth that has been lost to the silences of history. Yet the intent was unmistakable. She was to be removed from the ledger of the living with the same efficiency with which her name had been stripped from titles, the same precision that had already erased her from the decisions of state. And in this, her death was not so much a punishment as a formality, the closing of a page already deemed finished. Some accounts would later say she was given poison outright, a powder stirred into warmed wine so skillfully that it left no trace but a faint metallic bitterness on the tongue. Others would claim she was ordered to take her own life, presented with the cup as a gesture of choice, though there was none. For in the palace, refusal was merely another way of hastening the inevitable. Still others would suggest that she died by more ordinary means, the victim of an illness left untreated, her final days spent in fever while the court looked the other way. But among all these versions, one image remains constant: the solitary figure of the former empress seated before a low table, the cup in her hand catching the flicker of lamplight, her expression unreadable to those who served as reluctant witnesses, her posture as composed as it had been in the grandest days of her reign, as if she refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing fear in her eyes. And in that refusal, she retained the one power left to her, the control over the manner in which she would leave the world. The room around her would have been almost silent, save for the faint rustle of silk as an attendant shifted her weight, the slow drip of water from a basin in the corner, the occasional creak of wood as the night air cooled the beams overhead. Outside, in the courtyard, she could no longer walk freely. The guards stood at their posts with the stillness of men who knew their duty was not to protect, but to contain. Their presence a final reminder of the invisible walls that had closed around her life. If she thought of her sister Zhao Feiyan in those last moments, it might have been with a pang of gratitude or sorrow. For Feiyan's own fate was already shadowed by scandal and danger. Their paths so tightly bound in the court's memory that one's fall had always threatened to pull the other down. Perhaps she also thought of the emperor, the man who had lifted her from obscurity, whose favor had been both her crown and her undoing, whose absence had left her not merely without protection, but without purpose. It is easy to imagine her turning the cup slowly in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the coolness of the porcelain, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying a truth her face did not. The understanding that this was the final performance and that there would be no applause, no audience, no rewriting of the ending. For in the palace, the dead are spoken of only in the past tense, and even that past can be reshaped by those who survive. She drank, whether quickly to end the moment or slowly to mark it. And when the cup was empty, she placed it back on the table with the same deliberate grace she had once used to set down her sleeves after a dance. And in that small gesture was the echo of a life in which every movement had been watched, weighed, and judged. A life in which even the act of dying was not free from the demands of composure. No funeral procession wound through the palace to honor her. No banners were lowered, no sacrifices made in her name. Her death was recorded in the most economical of terms. Her body removed without ceremony, her belongings inventoried and reassigned. Her apartments left to gather dust until another occupant was deemed suitable. And in this erasure lay the final cruelty. For in the eyes of the court, she had ceased to exist long before her heart had stopped beating. Beyond the Vermilion Gates, news of her death traveled more swiftly than truth, carried in market gossip and roadside tales that shifted with each telling. Some painted her as a wicked enchantress whose end was long overdue. Others as a tragic figure destroyed by the very system that had once exalted her. And still others as a cautionary example of the fleeting nature of beauty and favor. And while none could agree on the details, all agreed on one thing. Zhao Feiyan had fallen, and there would be no return. In the stillness that followed, the palace resumed its rhythm as though she had never been part of it, the court moving on to new intrigues, new favorites, new rises and falls. Yet for those who had known her in the height of her reign, there must have been moments, passing a certain courtyard, hearing a certain melody, when they remembered the woman whose presence had once set the tone for the empire's most intimate spaces, and wondered how such radiance could have ended in such silence. Thus, the last cup of wine was not merely the end of a life, but the final act in a long play of power, desire, and survival. A play in which Zhao Feiyan had danced across the stage in robes of silk and shadow, only to find that when the lights went out, the audience had already turned away. In the months that followed Zhao Feiyan's death, it was not enough for the court to have ended her life quietly. In the Han Dynasty, true destruction meant ensuring that even the memory of a person could no longer move hearts or shape narratives. And so the work of erasure began, a process at once meticulous and merciless, carried out with the same bureaucratic precision as the drafting of a new law or the recording of a military victory, yet dedicated entirely to the dismantling of a single woman's legacy. The official scribes, whose brushes had once recorded her name alongside the emperor's in ceremonial decrees, now received instructions to strike her from the genealogies, to omit her from the lists of honored empresses, and to replace her in the imperial archives with a string of moral condemnations. No longer was she described as the light-footed beauty whose grace had captivated a ruler, but as a figure of corruption and decay. A cautionary tale placed in the same category as legendary temptresses blamed for the ruin of kings. Her life reduced to a weapon in the ongoing battle over how history should be remembered. Edicts were drafted, formally, impersonally, that declared her posthumous title void, a symbolic act meant to sever her entirely from the imperial line. The jade seal that had once been pressed into silk to mark her authority was locked away in a chest and given to another, and the ceremonial portraits that had hung in the women's quarters were removed, rolled tightly, and stored in places where time and neglect would ensure their eventual destruction. Even the craftsmen who had painted them likely knew that these works were never meant to be seen again. In the public proclamations read aloud in the markets and provincial courts, her name was paired with the gravest of accusations: licentiousness, manipulation, cruelty, the obstruction of heirs, the weakening of the emperor's will. These charges, whether grounded in fact, exaggeration, or outright invention, served the dual purpose of justifying her fall and warning the women of the court, both present and future, that the path she had walked could only ever end in disgrace, no matter how high the ascent or how skillful the performance. Among the people beyond the palace walls, the transformation of her image was rapid and complete. Ballads that had once praised her beauty were rewritten with sharper tones, her dances recast not as art, but as seduction. Her influence over the emperor depicted as a kind of sorcery that had clouded his judgment and invited misfortune upon the realm. In these retellings, she became less a woman of flesh and choice, and more an archetype, a shadow against which the virtues of other women could be contrasted, and a story told to daughters as both entertainment and warning. The scribes of later generations, drawing from these altered sources, embedded her in the long tradition of the Hongyan Huoshui, the beautiful woman who brings calamity, placing her alongside figures from earlier dynasties and mythic pasts, as though her life had been destined from the start to fit this pattern, as though she had been born already carrying the seeds of ruin. And once such a frame was placed over her memory, the possibility of recovering her as a more complex figure was almost entirely lost. Inside the palace, her absence was filled quickly. New favorites rose to the emperor's side, new intrigues unfolded, and the rooms she had once inhabited were reassigned without ceremony, their silks replaced, their furnishings rearranged so thoroughly that a visitor would never guess they had once been the stage for an empress's reign. Even her sister Zhao Heda's presence faded, for she too had become a liability in the eyes of those who sought to erase the sister's influence entirely, and the bond that had been central to Feiyan's power was treated as one more stain to be scrubbed from the record. For those who had known her in life, the rewriting of her story posed a dangerous choice. To remember her as she truly was risked aligning oneself with a disgraced name, yet to accept the official version required surrendering to a lie. Most chose the safety of silence, carrying their private memories like hidden contraband, sharing them only in whispers, if at all. And even then with the care of those who knew that the walls could hear and the wrong listener could turn a recollection into a death sentence. The tragedy of this erasure lay not only in the loss of her own voice, already stilled by death, but in the way it ensured that future generations would never hear the unfiltered accounts of those who had seen her in moments beyond the reach of rumor or propaganda. The laughter shared in private, the silences heavy with calculation, the weariness in her eyes after a night of endless performance. the stubborn pride that kept her chin lifted, even in the face of defeat. All of these were swept away beneath the thick strokes of moral judgment, leaving behind only a silhouette drawn by her enemies. This transformation from a living person into a moral allegory was not accidental. It was a function of imperial power, a reminder that the same system which could raise a dancer to the throne could also turn that throne into a scaffold, and that the preservation of order, at least as the court defined it, required not only the removal of those who disrupted it, but the careful crafting of narratives that would prevent others from following in their footsteps. In this way, Zhao Feiyan's life became less a biography than a parable, stripped of nuance, sharpened into a blade for use in the politics of memory. And so the woman who had once been the central ornament of the Han court, who had moved with such lightness that poets claimed the earth itself scarcely felt her steps, who had held the emperor's gaze through years of shifting alliances and dangerous whispers, was left to history not as a figure of grace or intelligence, but as a symbol of excess, manipulation, and decay. Her name, when it appeared at all, was a warning, a shadow cast across the bright image of the dynasty, a reminder that beauty could be both a crown and a curse. By the time a generation had passed, there were no official documents left that spoke of her with warmth or admiration. No courtly verses celebrating her charm, no portraits in the galleries of honored consorts. What survived was the version of her crafted by those who had needed her gone. The version that fit neatly into the moral frameworks of the historians. The version that erased her humanity in favor of a lesson that could be repeated without risk. That a woman who reached too far would fall, and that once she fell, even her memory would not be hers to keep. When I look back in the fragments of Zhao Feiyan's story, the lavish nights in silk, the whispered accusations of poisoned wombs, the sudden fall into captivity, the cup of wine that ended it all, I cannot help but feel the tension between the woman she was and the woman history wanted her to be. The official records give us the mask, the harlot who distracted an emperor, the beauty who hastened a dynasty's decay. The legends embroidered upon those records give us the shadow, a seductress whose ambition knew no bounds, a swallow-light body carrying the weight of a nation's decline. But neither the mask nor the shadow is enough to hold the truth of a living, breathing person who moved through joy, fear, calculation, and survival like any of us might, if trapped in a world that measured worth in beauty and obedience. History, especially in courts where power is a fragile, jealously guarded currency, has always been quick to make women into symbols, saints, temptresses, mothers, traitors, because symbols are easier to control than people. It is far easier to say that a dynasty fell because of one woman's charms than to admit the deeper causes. Political negligence, factional corruption, military strain, or the simple fact that emperors, like all men, are vulnerable to distraction and indulgence. In the end, to call Zhao Feiyan the most licentious woman in China's history tells us more about the anxieties of those who wrote the histories than about the woman herself. What survives of her is not her voice. No letter, no memoir, no personal defense, but the image drawn by others. And in that absence, I find the deepest cruelty. She never got to tell her own story. Every dance, every whispered conversation, every glance across a candlelit room has been repurposed by centuries of retelling, until the woman who lived them has almost vanished entirely. Perhaps that is why her story lingers with me. Not because she was faultless, but because she was silenced twice. First by the death of the man who shielded her, and then by the rewriting of her life into a warning she never agreed to become. Somewhere between truth and legend lies a human being who laughed, grieved, feared, and hoped, and who, in her final moments, may have understood that even death would not free her from the narratives of others. And maybe that is the cautionary tale we should take from Zhao Feiyan. Not that beauty destroys, but that power, in the hands of those who fear losing it, will always rewrite the past to suit the present. If we do not question those rewrites, we allow the erasures to stand, and we lose the chance to know the people behind the myths. If you want to keep uncovering the lives that history has twisted, silenced, or forgotten, lives like Zhao Feiyan's, where truth hides behind centuries of accusation and legend, then join me here. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, and together we'll keep pulling back the curtain on the past, one story at a time.